In GeoFS, there's no way to do a real, proper autoland. The best you can do is connect to the ILS and let the autopilot follow the ILS, flying all the way to touchdown, at which point you have to disconnect to maintain directional control. So in this video, we're gonna test to see the limitations of this so-called autoland. But before we go all the way up to the maximum crosswind available, we'll slowly increase to see how the autopilot reacts and controls the plane each time. Without further ado, let's get started. First up, we're going to give ourselves a benchmark to see how well the autopilot lands when there's no crosswind. Or rather, not just no crosswind, no wind at all. So the first step would be to get into the approach, and here I have started at 5,000 feet and 15 nautical miles from the airport. For the subsequent attempts, we are going to increase the crosswind by 10 knots each time, and this crosswind will always blow from the right, perpendicular to the landing runway. Now, let's see how the autopilot lands the plane. For this test, and every following one, I will disconnect the autopilot as soon as the aircraft touches down, deploy spoilers, brakes, and reverse thrust, and use rudder to maintain directional control. So essentially, we allow the autopilot to do everything up to touchdown. As we can see, it flies the plane too low on final, and doesn't even so much as flare. As a result, our plane touches down hard. A manual landing could obviously be much better, to get the plane to touch down more smoothly and within the touchdown zone, neither of which were fulfilled by the autopilot. However, with that done, let's move on and increase the crosswind. Our second test will be with 10 knots of perpendicular crosswind. I have started from the same location, and it will also be the same for our remaining few attempts. Same thing as last time, we are going to connect to the ILS, and let the autopilot do everything in the landing sequence, except after touchdown. As we can see, the 10 knots crosswind component forces the autopilot to crab the aircraft, as in, turn the nose of the aircraft into the wind. This is done so that the aircraft stays on the correct path, and is not blown out of alignment with the runway by the wind. Enough talk, now let's see how the autopilot touches down. Normally, the pilots would try to decrab the aircraft during a manual landing, as in, get the nose back aligned with the runway centerline to minimize the strain on the landing gear, but the autopilot doesn't do that. I wonder what will happen after it doesn't decrab in maximum crosswind. Still, this wasn't too bad. Moving on to 20 knots. This is where things get really interesting, so stick around. Now, first things first, as I'm sure you have seen by now, I've made the weather worse to simulate actual conditions in which there would be a stronger wind. Of course, I've also moved up to 20 knots perpendicular crosswind. With almost 40 km/h, or 25 mph winds, the autopilot now has to crab the aircraft even more strongly, at a greater angle, into the wind. Before this, the autopilot had more or less no problem controlling the aircraft and staying on the glide path. Now, however, with the strong, gusting winds, the autopilot is starting to struggle to get the aircraft to stay perfectly on the glide. Because of this, the aircraft now starts to fluctuate up and down of the glide slope intermittently, and these oscillations become more apparent during changes in configuration. The aircraft touches down hard, as usual, without decrabbing. Planes have a tendency to roll into the wind during touchdowns with crosswind conditions, and this effect becomes even more pronounced with stronger crosswinds. As a result, I have to apply cross controls, as in, apply rudder out of the wind but aileron into the wind. This gets the plane aligned with the runway while also preventing the right wing from lifting up. However, it still does so momentarily before I get it back down again. In this frantic sequence of events, I forget the reverse thrust, and activate it a while later into the rollout. I don't think adding more wind is a very good idea, but for the sake of content, let's do it. Now we increase to 30 knots, with deteriorating weather as well. Something I have noticed earlier, but is becoming increasingly obvious, is that the autopilot does not actually keep following the runway track. When coming in for landing, it aligns itself with a track left of the runway, and then increases its crab angle to get back on the runway track on final. I think this camera angle will give you a pretty good look at the crabbing of the aircraft. The aircraft is becoming increasingly hard to control on the ground, but since I have learned from experience, I managed to keep the plane from rolling. However, at the end of the rollout, when we were about to come to a stop, the plane yawed right so hard that we nearly excurted the runway. Now for the final boss. 40 knots. Our final test, a test of the aircraft autopilot, GeoFS physics, as well as my own pure skill. The margins are almost zero here. The plane is going up and down of the glide slope, with up to almost 1 full dot of deflection, and is also shaking from severe turbulence. As you can see, down on the ground, the aircraft is extremely difficult to control, with wild yawing movements to either side, and also rolling movements, with the latter a bit more subdued. We exited the runway a few times, and I'm sure we have a lot of broken backs in the back. Because of those ridiculous yaws, we stopped really fast actually. But I'm not sure any of my passengers would want to fly with me again. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the video. If you enjoyed, please subscribe to see more similar aviation content. Also, on your way out, if you would be so kind as to do me a favor, leave a like, and maybe a comment. Have a great day and see you next time.